Hitler didn't fear American soldiers. He feared American mechanics. While his elite panzer divisions were bogged down in the Russian mud, he watched in horror as the U.S. Army built a floating harbor the size of a city in just 12 days. They laid down roads faster than his tanks could advance. They rebuilt bridges he blew up in a matter of hours. This is the story of the unsung titans of Watu, the combat engineers who proved that a bulldozer could be more powerful than a Tiger tank. December 1944. The air in the Führer's East Prussian headquarters, the Wolfschanze, is thick with the scent of damp concrete, cigar smoke, and a final, desperate gamble. Outside, the ancient forests are locked in a glacial silence, blanketed in snow. Inside, the war rages across a massive map table, a living skin of a dying Reich stretched under the harsh glare of electric lamps. Adolf Hitler stands hunched over the map, a man possessed by a feverish energy. His generals, men of iron discipline and aristocratic bearing like Keitel and Jodl, stand in a rigid, respectful semicircle. The news from the front is, for the first time in months, good. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great throw of the dice, has broken the American lines. Panzer divisions are surging through the snow-choked forests, their objective the port of Antwerp, their goal to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The generals speak of armored spearheads, of encircling Patton's Third Army, of the siege of Bastogne. Their language is the familiar, brutal poetry of warfare, breakthroughs, salients, and kill zones. They point to the icons representing tank divisions and infantry corps. But Hitler's gaze is elsewhere. His finger, trembling slightly, stabs not at a combat unit, but at the thin blue lines spiderwebbing across the map, the rivers. Specifically, the bridges crossing them. His voice, usually a low rasp, rises with a strange, obsessive intensity. "The bridges," he repeats, the word cutting through the murmur of military jargon. "You are not seeing it. They cross them faster than we can blow them. Who is doing this?" A general offers a dry, technical answer. "The American engineer battalions, my Führer." A flicker of something, not just anger, but a profound, almost fearful understanding, crosses Hitler's face. He looks up from the map, his eyes burning with a cold fire, and he gives an order that hangs in the air like a strange, discordant note. It is an order that confuses his high command, men who thought they understood the grammar of war. He does not demand the annihilation of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. He does not scream for the destruction of Patton's tanks. Instead, he fixes his gaze on his generals and says, "Find their engineer units, the construction battalions. They are to be targeted. They are to be wiped out. Without them," he pauses, letting the realization land, "without these men, the Americans are nothing. They will stop." In a room dedicated to the grand art of destruction, the leader of the Third Reich had become obsessed with the humble act of construction. He saw something his own generals, experts in the calculus of combat, had missed. It was not the American soldier he feared most, nor the American tank. It was the American builder. What did he see on that map? What was it about these anonymous men with slide rules, bulldozers, and welding torches that struck such terror into the heart of a regime built on conquest? This is the story of how the builders became the most dangerous men in the world, and why a dictator, in his final raging moments, understood that the war would be won not by the side that could destroy the most, but by the side that could build the fastest. Before it was a myth, blitzkrieg was a method, not a magic, but a mathematics. Speed multiplied by surprise, guided by radio, enforced by nerve. Its grammar was simple and ruthless. Find a weak seam, strike with a narrow, hard fist, refuse the flanks, and drive until maps turn to guesswork. Tanks and motorized infantry formed the spearhead. Dive bombers ripped open the road ahead, and decentralized command, mission-type orders, let small units move like quicksilver through the gaps. But beneath the poetry of movement lay a prose as unforgiving as steel. Logistics. The spearhead is a beggar. It consumes fuel, rubber, tracks, and hours faster than any depot can dream. Every kilometer gained must be purchased twice, first with courage, then with gasoline. Blitzkrieg borrowed strength from tomorrow and spent it today. Germany's army was never as motorized as its legend. The tip glittered with engines, but the shaft was wood and bone, horses hauling guns, wagons crawling through mud, railheads gulping freight in the rear. The system worked so long as the thrust was short, and the rail net could be extended quickly behind it. It failed the moment the roads broke, the weather soured, or a river threw its blue, indifferent line across the advance. Rivers were not obstacles, they were gatekeepers. The doctrine assumed momentum would carry bridges intact into German hands. Shock arrives, defenders panic, charges fail, armor rolls. When that happened, the spear sang. When it didn't, when a span fell in a roar of dust and iron, the song ended in a choking silence. A blown bridge turns a steel column into a traffic jam. Tanks idling, fuel tanks sweating in the sun, infantry lining ditches, officers pacing with maps that suddenly mean less than a single missing girder. Here the unsung masters of movement stepped forward, the pioneers, Germany's combat engineers. They were trained to breach, to blast, to ferry, to lay and lift mines, to improvise crossings under fire. In the bright years of conquest, they delivered miracles, rubber boats swarming a river at dawn, assault rafts nosing into current, folding bridges clacking into place as Stukas pinned enemy gunners to their parapets. The Meuse in the west, the Bug in the east, names that became verbs, crossings turned into legends. Then the geometry changed. Air superiority moved to the other side. Bridges half-built in daylight became invitations to catastrophe. Pontoon parks lit by welding arcs drew storms of metal from the sky. Gasoline, the oxygen of movement, thinned to a wheeze. Tires shredded on roads cratered by bombs. Engines ran hot. Tracks broke teeth. And the rivers, those quiet arbiters, kept their counsel and their current. Blitzkrieg had always been a race against friction. Mud, cold, distance, and fatigue waited like patient creditors. The longer the thrust, the higher the interest. A culvert gone here, a viaduct dropped there, and what had been a corridor became a maze. Every detour bled time. Every hour burned fuel. Every delay stretched the spear until it grew thin enough to snap. Look closely at the map and you see it. A doctrine dependent on the enemy's mistakes. If the defender is slow, bridges fall late. If he is quick, they fall early. If he is disorganized, rails are captured with their switches intact. If he is methodical, junctions are cut and yards are ash. Blitzkrieg thrives on the former and starves on the latter. It is a method of exploitation more than endurance, brilliance in the sprint that falters in the marathon. By the winter, when the Ardennes forest swallowed engines and hope, the contradiction stood naked. Germany could still create shock locally, gather fuel, hide tanks under trees, strike through snow and fog, but it could not sustain shock strategically. Behind every temporary breakthrough lurked a ledger of repairs it could not afford. Miles of ruined road, shuttered railheads, skeleton depots, bridges blown to twisted ribs. The pioneers could still work wonders, but not at the pace the front now demanded, not under the whip of enemy air, not with the material famine gnawing every unit from tip to tail. Across the lines, a different philosophy took shape, not to avoid friction, but to eat it. Where Blitzkrieg sought to leap gaps, the American way of war resolved to fill them. Fix roads faster than they can be cratered, replace bridges faster than they can be dropped, restore ports faster than they can be wrecked. One method gambled on speed to sidestep the world's resistance. The other planned to absorb that resistance and grind through it. And this is where the engine stalls, not in the courage of the men or the cunning of their leaders, but in the cold arithmetic of rivers crossed and roads made whole. An army that cannot repair what it breaks or what is broken before it becomes a meteor, brilliant, brief, and doomed to fade. An army that can rebuild as it advances becomes something else entirely, a weather system, slow to start, impossible to stop. In the end, Blitzkrieg's sharp edge met the blunt, patient strength of construction. The first can pierce, the second can pave. Hitler, staring at his maps, finally saw the difference. The bridges mattered more than the tanks that crossed them. The men who built the path mattered more than the men who marched upon it. Before they were soldiers, they were makers. Surveyors who could read a landscape the way a doctor reads a pulse. Steel workers who knew how heat persuades metal. Road crews who turned mud into promise. America did not merely mobilize men, it mobilized trades. When the factories lit their furnaces, the army lit classrooms and quarries, turning craftsmen into combat engineers, builders who could work while being shot at. The blueprint came together in quiet places with names that rarely make the maps, training centers carved from scrub and clay, where the first generation of engineer combat battalions learned a curriculum written by war. Fort Belvoir taught the art and arithmetic of bridging, loads, spans, currents, the unforgiving physics of water. Fort Leonard Wood drilled men to carve roads out of hillsides, to move earth with dozers as confidently as infantry moved over it. Other camps taught demolitions not as spectacle, but as grammar. Shape the charge, place the caps, speak the language of controlled destruction that makes a crossing possible where none exists. Organization followed function. The Army drew a sharp line between the heavy construction units, the General Service and Special Service Engineer regiments that would rebuild ports, repair rail yards, and raise depots, and the leaner, harder engineer combat battalions that marched with the frontline divisions. The former carried the nation's toolbox. The latter carried it under fire. A combat engineer battalion could throw a treadway bridge across a river at night, sweep and mark a minefield by dawn, blast a road through a hedgerow by noon, and by evening be shoulder to shoulder with infantry, carbines up, clearing a village room by room. Their weapons looked like a workshop's inventory, bulldozers wearing weld plates like armor, graders biting at rutted clay, dump trucks moving gravel like blood to wounded roads. On their shoulders and in their hands, the specialists' implements became a fighting kit. Bangalore torpedoes to chew wire and teeth, satchel charges to take the spine out of concrete dragon's teeth, handheld detectors to give a voice to the earth where mines lay like seeds of malice. They learned to lay fascines and cribbing, to anchor Bailey panels and lash pontons in a current that wanted them for its own. Doctrine adapted around them. Infantry learned that the first men onto a beach or into a breach need not be riflemen. They needed to be problem solvers with explosives. Armor learned patience. A tank is a blunt argument without a causeway or a culvert beneath it. Corps and Army staffs learned to treat engineers not as a rear area amenity, but as an advance guard of momentum. A thrust was not truly planned until the questions had answers. Where is the bridge? Who holds the banks? How fast can we replace what the enemy will surely erase? The Naval Service reached for the same truth across different water. The United States Navy raised a force with a name like a shrug and a bite like a promise. Construction battalions, the Seabees. We build, we fight, they said, and then they did. In coral and jungle, they gouged airstrips from green hell, piled rock into breakwaters, drove pilings through surf that wanted them dead. In the European theater, they would lash together causeways, assemble floating piers, and nurse damaged harbors back to life, turning ruined waterfronts into arteries through which an army could breathe. Industrial muscle made the improbable routine. The American genius was less for invention than for multiplication. Take a good idea and stamp enough of it to change a continent. Prefabrication was the quiet revolution. Bridges would arrive at a river the way children's toys arrive on living room floors, in labeled crates, panel by panel, pin by pin, a kit whose only secret ingredient was sweat. Floating treadways rode on pneumatic pontons that could be inflated, launched, and aligned in a rhythm learned by rote and refined under fire. Timber trestles sprang from axe and saw. When obstacles were too big to remove, engineers learned to go around them, over them, through them, never, ever to stop before them. The faces behind this machinery were as unromantic as the work was heroic. A foreman from Akron who had poured highways on WPA crews now paced a riverbank with a clipboard darkened by rain. A farm boy who could fix a thresher in the field now kept a dozer running on gasoline that smelled like fear. A young civil engineer who had drawn lines for a bridge firm now tightened pins with oil-blackened hands while tracers zipped low over the water. They spoke a dialect of depth and camber, of footing and fall, of culvert and crown, and learned, because they had to, a second dialect made of passwords and field stripping and the intimate weight of a carbine. Supply followed their needs. The quartermaster moved pallets of steel panels as if they were rations. Depots sprouted stacks of timber and coils of wire, drums of fuel and crates of detonators. Railway flat cars groaned under bulldozers chained like sullen beasts. No theater was starved so long as the line of communication remained intact, and keeping it intact became the engineer's sacred charge. When rain turned roads to porridge, they threw down corduroy. When frost heaved bridges into grotesques, they spiked them level and kept the convoys rolling. When artillery chewed a cut into a highway, they arrived like a surgery team, carving, patching, smoothing, sending the patient on with a white chalked "open" on its chest. And always, the clock. Their victories were not measured only in yards conquered, but in minutes salvaged. How fast to sweep this lane through a minefield? How long to swing a treadway into place over a river running cold and high? How many hours to make a ruined port take its first breath again? Time, for the engineers, was both enemy and prize. Every saved minute compounded into days stolen from the enemy's hope. The impartial eye of history will say this without rhetoric. An army that can replace what the defender destroys will not be denied for long. The engineers gave the Allied advance its second heart, one that beat in diesel and hydraulics, in the steady thump of panels set and pins driven home. If the rifle won ground and the tank kept it, the engineer made that ground connect to the next day's map. That is why, when a dictator squinted at rivers and railheads and could not understand why the blue veins of his defense kept refilling, his finger finally found the truth. It was not just the fighters he had to fear, it was the builders. Every army has its wonder weapons, the secret projects and technological marvels designed to break the stalemate of war. Germany had its V-rockets and jet fighters, sleek, terrifying machines of vengeance. The Allies had the atomic bomb, a power that could unmake the world. But perhaps the most decisive wonder weapon of the European war was one that never fired a shot. It was a bridge, and it was brilliant. Its genius lay in its utter simplicity. The Bailey Bridge was not a grand feat of civil engineering. It was a grammar of steel, a child's construction set scaled for giants. Invented by a quiet British civil servant named Donald Bailey, it was a modular system based on a handful of prefabricated, interchangeable parts. The core component was the panel, a cross-braced rectangle of steel, light enough to be lifted by 6 men, yet strong enough to form the lattice of a war-winning weapon. These panels were locked together with simple steel pins, hammered into place with sledgehammers. No rivets, no welding, no complex machinery required. The process was a miracle of battlefield choreography. As one team assembled the bridge on the riverbank, another would build a lightweight, launching nose at its tip. Then, with rollers and raw muscle, the entire structure would be pushed out over the abyss, a skeleton of promise inching its way across the water. Once it touched the far bank, the launching nose was removed, wooden decking was laid, and the bridge inhaled its first breath of traffic. Its versatility was breathtaking. If a bridge needed to be stronger to carry the weight of a Sherman or Churchill tank, the engineers simply added more panels, side by side or stacked vertically, creating double single or triple configurations. If a river was too wide, the bridge could be supported midstream on pontoons, turning it into a floating roadway. It was a solution that could adapt to fit the size of any problem. Before the Bailey, a destroyed bridge was a strategic victory for the defender. It meant a delay of days, even weeks. It meant bringing up heavy cranes, specialized engineers, and tons of raw materials. A blown bridge was a full stop. The Bailey Bridge turned the full stop into a comma. The impact was immediate and profound. A panzer division, retreating, could meticulously demolish a beautiful stone arch bridge, confident they had bought themselves a week's respite. They would fall back, set up their defensive lines, and wait. And then, a day later, they would hear it, the familiar rumble of Allied supply trucks. The bridge they had destroyed had been replaced. The river, which had believed itself a victor, had been tamed overnight. This was a weapon not against an army, but against a tactic. It rendered the scorched earth policy impotent. What was the point of destroying your own infrastructure if the enemy could rebuild it faster than you could retreat? It was a demoralizing, relentless demonstration of industrial power. The Americans, with their genius for mass production, churned out miles of Bailey bridging. It flowed into Europe in a constant stream, a river of steel to cross the rivers of water. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a man not known for lavish praise, declared that the Bailey Bridge, along with the bulldozer and the landing craft, was one of the 3 pieces of equipment that made the Allied victory in Europe possible. It was an invisible weapon because its success was measured in what didn't happen. The convoys that weren't delayed, the tanks that didn't run out of fuel, the offensives that didn't stall. It was the quiet, clanging, brutally effective engine of Allied momentum. And now, this humble collection of panels and pins was about to face its ultimate test on the blood-soaked sands of Normandy. Hell had a timetable. For the first waves of men churning towards the coast of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the invasion was not a battle of movement, but a race against the tide. And the men who had to win that race were the engineers. Their destination was a stretch of sand code-named Omaha, a place that would shortly become a byword for slaughter. On the crisp architectural drawings back in England, the plan was a model of military precision. Special engineer task forces, landing with the very first infantrymen, had exactly 30 minutes. 30 minutes of low tide to accomplish a task of almost unimaginable difficulty, to blast 16 50-yard-wide gaps through the lethal forest of obstacles that choked the beach. Field Marshal Rommel had planted this garden of death. It was not a wall of concrete, but a serrated fringe of steel and wood designed to gut landing craft and channel men into the perfectly sited kill zones of machine guns and artillery nested on the bluffs above. There were Belgian gates, massive steel frames like guillotine blades, hedgehogs, heavy, crossed-over steel beams, and angled logs tipped with teller mines. It was a mechanical reef waiting to tear the belly out of the invasion. The ramps of the landing craft dropped, and the plan dissolved into chaos. Instead of a coordinated assault, it was a bloodbath. Men, weighed down by 60 pounds of gear and explosives, were pitched into the cold, churning surf. They were cut down by machine gun fire that scythed across the beach with the sound of ripping canvas. They drowned in the shell-churned water. They fell before they even reached the sand. For the engineers, the mission was paradoxical and suicidal. While the infantryman's instinct was to find cover, the engineer's job was to run into the open, into the very teeth of the fire, toward the obstacles. Their weapons were not rifles, but sacks of C2 explosives, primacord, and detonators. They were surgeons operating in a hurricane, their scalpels made of high explosive. Small teams, what was left of them, struggled through the red-tinged surf, dragging their burdens. A sergeant and 2 privates reach a steel hedgehog. They are the only survivors of their 30-man team. Under a relentless hail of fire, they work with numb, frozen fingers to attach the charges, their movements a desperate ballet of survival. They jam the fuses, scramble back through the water to a sliver of cover behind a disabled tank, and pray. The explosion is a sharp, brutal crack against the cacophony of the battle. The hedgehog is mangled, twisted, but not gone. The rising tide, indifferent to courage, is already swirling around their knees, threatening to cover the remaining obstacles before they can be touched. The sea itself has become an enemy, allied with the Germans, seeking to drown the wounded and hide the targets. The casualty rates were inhuman. The Special Engineer Task Force on Omaha suffered over 40% casualties in the first hour. Whole teams vanished, their missions unfulfilled. The meticulously planned gaps did not materialize. The timetable was in shreds. But in the midst of the slaughter, something incredible happened. Small, leaderless groups of men, driven by sheer grit and the knowledge that failure meant the death of everyone on the beach, kept working. They improvised. They consolidated their explosives. They ignored the grand plan and focused on what was in front of them. A handful of men would blow a single hedgehog. Another group would manage to damage a Belgian gate. They did not clear the 16 planned gaps. They cleared 5, maybe 6, and even those were partial, treacherous paths littered with wreckage. But it was enough. Through these narrow, hard-won channels, the invasion began to bleed ashore. A Sherman tank, waterproofed and lumbering, cautiously navigated a path cleared just minutes before. A column of infantry, huddled behind it, used the tank as a shield to finally get off the sand and onto the shingle. The engineers had not won the beach. They had opened a crack in it. A crack just wide enough for the might of the Allied armies to begin to force its way through. While others fought for yards of sand, the engineers fought for the possibility of the battle. Their victory was measured in mangled steel and a path, however narrow, through hell. Victory is a hungry beast. After the breakout from Normandy in July 1944, the Allied armies surged across France with astonishing speed. Patton's Third Army was a runaway train, covering ground so fast that it threatened to outrun its own shadow. This triumph created a new, terrifying problem. The advance was starving. The French railway system, the traditional circulatory system of any European army, was a corpse. Allied bombers and French resistance saboteurs had done their work too well. The great ports like Cherbourg were captured, but the Germans had left them as shattered, twisted ruins of concrete and steel. The spearhead of the Allied advance was in danger of grinding to a halt, not from German resistance, but from empty fuel tanks and ammunition boxes. Patton was screaming for gasoline. The solution was born of desperation in a 36-hour meeting. It was named the Red Ball Express, a term borrowed from American railroad slang for priority freight. The concept was brutally simple: a one-way, non-stop loop of trucks running 24 hours a day on roads reserved exclusively for their use. It was to be a massive, improvised circulatory system designed to pump the lifeblood of war from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. The drivers, the red blood cells of this system, were mostly African American soldiers. For 83 consecutive days, they performed a feat of superhuman endurance. They drove their deuce-and-a-half, 2.5-ton trucks until their eyes burned, subsisting on coffee and adrenaline. They faced sniper fire, landmines, and the constant threat of mechanical breakdown. They learned to switch places without stopping, one man sleeping while the other gripped the wheel. The low drone of their engines became the unending soundtrack of the pursuit across France. At its peak, nearly 6,000 trucks were on the road, hauling about 12,500 tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, food, blood plasma, every single day. It was a relentless, grinding display of America's industrial might made manifest on the roads of France. The Red Ball Express was more than a supply route. It was a strategic weapon. It completely neutralized Germany's primary defensive tactic, the strategic retreat. The Wehrmacht could blow every bridge and crater every road, confident that they had bought themselves time. But time was a currency the Red Ball Express refused to honor. The engineers, following close behind the combat troops, would throw a Bailey Bridge over a river, and within hours, the familiar red-balled trucks would be rumbling across it. This relentless flood of supplies demoralized the German high command. It was a phenomenon they could not replicate and could not counter. Their own withered supply lines were dependent on horse-drawn carts and a shattered rail network. The Red Ball Express was a weapon born not in a laboratory, but on an assembly line. The engineers laid the bones of the road. The Red Ball Express was the blood that flowed over them, ensuring the beast of victory never went hungry. The maps in the wolf's lair had become instruments of torture. Each day, they told a story of collapse. Hitler, surrounded by generals steeped in the traditions of Clausewitz and Schlieffen, watched as the front lines in the West bled eastward with a speed that defied military logic. His commanders offered familiar explanations: overwhelming Allied air power, superior numbers, the collapse of their own exhausted divisions. But these were symptoms, not the disease. Hitler, a man who trusted his own distorted intuition over the calculated advice of his staff, saw something else. He saw a ghost on the map. He saw an army that did not play by the rules. His generals, men like Alfred Jodl, would present the daily reports: a bridge over the Seine destroyed, a key rail junction near Orléans obliterated, a fuel depot at Amiens left in flaming ruins. By all the laws of war, this should have bought them time. An armored division, like Patton's Third Army, consumed astronomical quantities of fuel, some 150,000 gallons a day when advancing. To push hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches was, by German military science, a logistical impossibility. Jodl and others calculated that Patton's spearheads must grind to a halt any day, their tanks running dry in the fields of France. It was not a hope, it was a mathematical certainty. But they did not stop. The red lines on the map indicating Patton's advance kept creeping forward. The reports were maddening. A bridge is blown, and the Americans span the river in less than 24 hours. A road is cratered, and they pave a bypass through a field. A port is wrecked, and within weeks, it is unloading thousands of tons of supplies a day. Captured German officers, men like Hans von Luck, spoke with a kind of baffled awe about an enemy who seemed to treat supplies not as a limitation, but as an infinite resource. The epiphany struck Hitler not as a single flash of insight, but as a slow, dawning horror. He was not fighting a traditional European army. He was fighting an industrial system. He was fighting Detroit. He was fighting a nation of builders who had weaponized the assembly line and the construction site. His own military philosophy was rooted in the idea of the decisive battle, the brilliant maneuver, the stroke of tactical genius that could shatter an enemy's will. It was the philosophy of a gambler. The Americans were playing a different game. They were not gambling, they were grinding. They accepted friction, chaos, and destruction as part of the equation, and then they simply overwhelmed it with sheer, brute force production and repair. The Red Ball Express was the most insolent symbol of this new reality. Its convoys, headlights blazing in defiance of all military doctrine, were a rolling monument to a power he could not comprehend. When Field Marshal von Rundstedt, his commander in the West, finally received comprehensive intelligence on the operation, his conclusion was stark. We face something beyond military solution. Their culminating point doesn't exist. They have revolutionized warfare. For Hitler, this was more than a strategic problem. It was an ideological one. The Untermenschen, the mongrel race of capitalists and cowboys, were supposed to be decadent and disorganized. Yet they had created a logistical organism more efficient and resilient than anything his own rigidly hierarchical system could produce. They were defeating him not with superior tactics, but with superior civilization. It was in this context that his bizarre order during the Ardennes offensive was born, when he demanded that his panzer divisions target the American engineer battalions. He was finally trying to attack the disease, not the symptoms. He had realized, far too late, that the source of the Allies' seemingly magical momentum was not the men with the rifles, but the men with the wrenches and bulldozers. He understood that if he could just kill the builders, the whole magnificent, terrifying machine would finally grind to a halt. Before the first gun spoke on 16th of December 1944, the objective was already printed in red on German maps: the Meuse. To get there through the winter forest, one fact mattered more than divisions and decorations: bridges. The plan lived or died on whether panzers could reach spans before American engineers could drop them into black water. It wasn't poetry. It was a race between steel and a plunger. At 05:30, the barrage rolled out like thunder stitched to fog. In the mist that followed, assault teams crossed the Our on rubber boats and makeshift ferries, hauling rope and rifles, whispering passwords into air that smelled of sap and cordite. Behind them, the armored spearheads crept forward, headlights hooded, drivers counting curves they had memorized by finger and prayer. The best units in the West carried a new kind of urgency in their orders: seize the crossings intact, by speed, by ruse, by terror if necessary. If the span fell, improvise. But do not stop. The bridges must not fall. Ahead of them, the builders were already at work. American engineer combat battalions had arrived in the Ardennes to rest, to mind roadblocks and string a few mines along sleepy lanes. They carried Bangalore torpedoes and handsaws, not the mythology of elite shock troops. Yet when the forest heaved and the world beyond the tree line began to move, these men became something else: gatekeepers with the authority to end roads. They had spent quiet days counting girders, measuring abutments, and laying out tangles of primer cord like veins in winter grass. They marked detonation switches with grease pencil in the gum-thick dark of culverts. They memorized times and distances, how long to blow one span, where to rig the next, where a road could be chewed into a ditch to kill a convoy with geometry. Their map symbols were simple: X for a cut, star for a charge, circle for a last resort. Now the forest delivered its verdict. German vanguards seeped through the fog toward names that would become hard edges in the story: Saint-Vith, Stavelot, Trois Ponts, Bastogne. In those places, engineer officers in oversized parkas stood on bridge decks, with a hand on the plunger, listening to the wood and steel sing under the weight of their decision. The rule was cruel. You waited until the enemy was almost at the lip, because time was value and value was life. Then you let the river eat. Kampfgruppe Piper, a black spear point of tanks and half-tracks, saw the bridges at the Amblève and the Somme as rungs on a ladder to the Meuse. His columns lunged for Stavelot and Trois Ponts, engines growling, infantry clinging to hulls, commanders peering down winter streets narrowed by stone and smoke. At Stavelot, the first shock worked. The leading tanks smashed into town before the Americans could trigger destruction. The river gave him a way west. He could smell the big water beyond, the Meuse where speed would harden into momentum. Then the race found its moment. On the road to Trois Ponts, an American engineer battalion under a young colonel had been out here for days as winter caretakers, mining lanes, drilling holes in frost-stiff timbers, laying primer cord across slabs like spider silk. Through the freezing dawn, they had listened to rumors, tigers in the trees, whispering Germans in American uniforms, guns that moved with the wind. Now the rumor became a shape through the fog. Panthers, their long guns level, their engines low. The engineers held. With minutes, some say seconds, to spare, they fired the charges. The bridge rose, arched, snapped like a jaw, and fell away in a cough of stone and steam. The shock slapped the windows of the houses like an officer's hand. When the smoke thinned, the Panthers stared at a gap widened by current and winter, not by negotiation. Piper turned north to find another span. North, another bridge boomed and fell. West, a third went down under the boots of men who had waited to the last possible heartbeat for the river to keep its promise. Suddenly, speed turned to hunger. The columns groped for another way. Engineers blew culverts into craters, spiked road junctions with mines, spooled and unspooled wire as if knitting the forest itself into barbed cloth. Bulldozers, their exhausts coughing white, shoved trees into barricades that turned avenues into mousetraps. When the Germans tried deception, English-speaking commandos flipping signposts and passwords, engineer guards at bridges turned into catechists of suspicion, asking questions only a soul from Kansas or the Bronx could answer right, buying minutes with doubt. It was not clean. Roadblocks became firefights. Engineers fought as infantry in quilted parkas, carbines hard against the cheek, bazookas balanced on frozen shoulders. The tidy distinction between support and combat dissolved under the weight of winter and need. At Stavelot, they fought for fuel dumps as if each drum were a life, because it was. German life, German miles, German days. At small, forgettable bridges with names nobody memorized, corporals became decision-makers. A sergeant put his hand on a plunger, looked downriver at men still crossing back, and chose to wait, and wait, and wait, then choose to end a road and save a front. Bastonia's ring of roads, too, told the same hard truth. Engineers fused mines into ice and threw timber into ditches until a tank would have to ask permission of physics to pass. Shoulder to shoulder with paratroopers, they felled trees into abatis, cut lanes where they wanted lanes, and denied them where they did not. When a bridge had to stand to keep a town alive, they wrapped it in sandbags and prayer and called down artillery in belts in front of it. When a bridge had to die, they cut it free cleanly, like surgeons sealing a wound. The German hunt for builders sharpened with frustration. Machine guns stitched at demo teams crouched under spans. Tanks threw HE into culverts and huts where the men with wire might be hiding. Mortars walked their blasts methodically across roads marked with the telltale boredom of prep work. Holes drilled, cord laid, sand stacked. And still, at the moment the map said now, bridges went away, like extinguished candles, like drawn breath withheld. In the cold accounting that followed each blast, an hour here meant a battalion there. A day bought at Trois Ponts meant a week stolen from Antwerp. The panzer divisions found themselves circling a maze designed by men who used tape measures and sledgehammers. Fuel gauges turned accusatory. Radios filled with questions that had no answers. Another bridge, another road, another span. Eventually the answers were all the same. No. 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 The slaughter in the Ardennes had its famous names and its atrocities. Its maps are thick with arrows and thorns. But hidden under the noise is the geometry of denial drawn by engineers in wool gloves. They didn't win duels. They won hours. and hours, in December 1944, were the only currency that mattered. The offensive that began as a gamble ended as a siege against physics. Bridges are not romantic things. They are agreements with distance. The American engineers tore those agreements up one by one until the distance itself joined their side. In the wreckage along the Amblève and the Somme, girders frozen into grotesque parentheses, decking hung like broken ribs, you can read the simple sentence that stopped the last German hope. You shall not pass here. Not now. Not in time. The Rhine was not just a river. It was a psychological moat, a last, deep breath of German identity. For centuries, it was the border, the natural wall against which empires had broken. To cross it was to pierce the heartland. In the spring of 1945, with the Reich crumbling, every bridge was wired for destruction. The order was absolute. Not one span was to fall into Allied hands. Then, on March 7th, a miracle happened. A small task force from the U.S. 9th Armored Division, probing towards the town of Remagen, crested a hill and saw something impossible. The Ludendorff railway bridge, scarred but still standing. A mad scramble ensued. German engineers, panicked and under fire, triggered their demolition charges. The bridge shuddered, coughed a plume of black smoke, and then settled. The main charge had failed to detonate. What followed was a feat of pure, unadulterated American audacity. A young lieutenant led a platoon of infantry and engineers in a mad dash across the 1,000-foot span, cutting wires and kicking charges into the river as they went. By afternoon, against all odds, they had secured the far bank. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, an invading army was across the Rhine. The news electrified Allied command. Eisenhower, upon hearing of the capture, famously exclaimed it was worth its weight in gold. The unexpected bridgehead tore a hole in German defensive plans. Hitler was apoplectic, ordering furious counterattacks, V-2 rockets, and even new Arado R-234 jet bombers to destroy the bridge. For 10 days, the bridge held, a lifeline of steel shuddering under constant bombardment. Meanwhile, the engineers performed a second miracle. While the Ludendorff bridge groaned under the strain, U.S. Army combat engineers worked frantically beside it. They were a symphony of organized chaos. In the freezing water, under artillery fire, they began to assemble the tools of their trade. Giant pontoon bridges, their sections nudged into place by small powerboats, began to snake across the current. Alongside them, the skeletal, erector-set elegance of the Bailey Bridge took shape, panel by interlocking panel. Even when the battered Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed on March 17th, killing 33 engineers, it no longer mattered. The builders had already won. A whole family of new temporary bridges now spanned the river, and 5 American divisions were firmly established on the east bank, ready to break out into Germany's industrial heartland. Further north, the planned assault crossing, Operation Plunder, unfolded on a gargantuan scale on March 23rd. It was D-Day all over again, but this time with a river instead of a sea. After a stupendous artillery bombardment of 4,000 guns, waves of assault boats carrying British, Canadian, and American troops hit the eastern bank. Overhead, 2 entire airborne divisions descended in a blizzard of parachutes and gliders to secure the bridgehead from behind. And once again, as soon as the first foothold was secured, the engineers moved in. They laid smoke screens that blinded German gunners. They drove amphibious DUKW trucks straight from the roads into the river. They began assembling massive pontoon and Bailey bridges even as the battle raged around them. Within days, the Rhine, the Great Barrier, was stitched together with a dozen new arteries of steel and wood, and the Allied armies were pouring into Germany in an unstoppable flood. The assault on the Rhine was the engineers' magnum opus. It was a perfect storm of courage, audacity, and overwhelming industrial might. They had not just crossed a river, They had erased it. The last great physical and psychological barrier to victory had fallen, not to a brilliant tactic, but to the relentless, grinding power of the builders. They were not an elite. Their unit designations, the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion, the 146th, the 51st, were anonymous numbers on a vast order of battle, names that never carried the mythic weight of the 101st Airborne or the 1st Infantry Division. Their faces rarely made it onto propaganda posters. They were the men in the background, covered in mud or grease, their helmets pushed back, a cigarette dangling from their lips as they squinted at a transit or wrestled a steel pin into place. Who were they? They were America, distilled to its most practical essence. They were college boys from engineering schools like MIT and Caltech who suddenly found their abstract knowledge of stress loads and soil mechanics tested by artillery fire and frozen ground. They were grizzled construction foremen from the great dam projects of the Depression era, men who knew how to move earth and command crews with a gravelly voice and a steady hand. They were mechanics who could field strip a bulldozer's engine in the dark, lumberjacks who could drop a tree with surgical precision to block a road, and miners who understood the intimate grammar of explosives. They were kids from the farm who had spent their lives fixing machinery with baling wire and ingenuity. The Army's pitch was straightforward. You are going to make sure that our own troops move ahead against all opposition. Their mission was threefold: ensure mobility for friendly forces, create counter-mobility for the enemy, and, when necessary, fight as infantry. They were a hybrid force, a soldier with a rifle in one hand and a slide rule in the other. Their toolkit was a catalog of raw power. It ranged from hand tools like axes and shovels to the mechanical beasts that defined the American way of war: the bulldozers that clawed roads out of mountainsides, the cranes that lifted steel like children's toys, and the dump trucks that moved the very earth itself. They deployed a sophisticated arsenal of demolition charges, Bangalore torpedoes for clearing wire, and highly sensitive mine detectors that gave a voice to the silent threat beneath the soil. These were not men who sought the glory of the front line. Their work was often slow, methodical, and brutally exhausting. They worked in freezing rivers and on sun-baked airstrips under the constant threat of sniper fire, artillery, and booby traps. Their victories were not measured in ground taken, but in obstacles overcome. A Bailey Bridge completed hours ahead of schedule was a victory. A minefield cleared without a single casualty was a victory. A road kept open during a blizzard, allowing a column of tanks to reach the front, was a victory. They were the unsung, unseen titans of the war. They were the ones who translated the grand strategy of the generals into the physical reality of a road, a bridge, an airstrip. While the infantry fought the battle, the engineers made the battle possible. They were the men who paved the road to victory, one muddy, dangerous, exhausting yard at a time. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, a strange quiet descended on Europe. The roar of bombers was replaced by the grinding of gears. The crack of rifles gave way to the clang of hammers on steel. The work of destruction was over. The work of rebuilding had begun. And the men leading this new campaign were the same men who had made the final victory possible: the engineers. Their legacy is written across the landscape of modern Europe, though much of it is now invisible. The Bailey Bridges, those temporary stitches across the wounds of war, were gradually replaced by permanent structures. The hastily repaired ports were rebuilt. The roads paved in mud and fury were covered over with smooth asphalt. But for a time, Europe's recovery was built upon the skeletal framework left behind by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The war itself had been a brutal, transformative education. It had proven, beyond any doubt, that modern warfare was a contest of logistics and industrial capacity. The side that could move the fastest, repair the quickest, and build the most resilient supply chains would inevitably triumph. The image of the lone, heroic soldier was supplanted by the reality of a vast, interconnected system, and the engineer was the master of that system. This lesson reshaped the post-war military. The engineer was no longer a supporting player, but a central figure in strategic planning. The ability to project power became synonymous with the ability to build and maintain infrastructure anywhere in the world, under any conditions. The conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond would see engineers reprising their World War II roles, clearing mines, building bridges, and carving airstrips out of hostile territory. But the greatest legacy of the builders of victory was not military, it was philosophical. They embodied a uniquely American approach to problem solving, a pragmatic, can-do spirit that saw every obstacle not as a barrier, but as a project. They approached a bombed-out harbor or a cratered highway with the same methodical, relentless optimism that had built the Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge. It was a belief that any problem could be solved with enough ingenuity, enough horsepower, and enough hard work. Hitler, in his final desperate days, had seen the truth. He was defeated not by a superior warrior ideology, but by a superior system of making and doing. He was defeated by the quiet, anonymous men who could look at a ruined bridge and see not an end, but a beginning. He was defeated by the unseen titans who understood that the most powerful weapon in any war is the ability to build the road home. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.